Welcome to episode 70 of Beyond Distribution with GTDC. I'm Kavita May, SVP of Planning of Operations with the GTDC, and I'm really glad that you're joining us. Today, we're digging into what all the recent geopolitical uncertainty means for the global economy and what it means for businesses trying to plan, invest, and make smart decisions in the middle of it all. Frank Vitagliano is joined again by Emily Mansfield, Regional Director from the Economist Intelligence Unit, who helps break down everything from tariffs and policy shifts to what's happening with pricing, inflation, and growth expectations. They also talk about why scenario planning is more important than ever right now and how leaders can start thinking through different outcomes instead of trying to predict just one. It's a really insightful conversation with some practical takeaways, plus a quick look ahead at the upcoming GTDC Summit EMEA in Nordwijk. Let's dive in.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of Beyond Distribution. I am thrilled today to have somebody who is hopefully familiar to all of you because she's joined us a few times in the past, Emily Mansfield. Emily is the Regional Director for the Economist Intelligence Unit in Europe. So, Emily, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Emily has, as many of you I'm sure know, has presented at our European event the last 2 years, and she'll also be presenting this year coming up in mid-April. We'll talk about that more. But Emily, every time we are together, there seems to be so much going on in the world relative to the space that you are an expert in. So let's dive right into it. And obviously, I think we have to talk about and address, the most current situation that we're in, which is the conflict in, Iran and the Middle East, and what you're seeing there, and then how you feel some of the implications of that will play out as we move along here.
Absolutely. So I think really this just underlines quite how volatile and unstable the world economy and geopolitics are at the moment, and just how many risks this provides that firms then have to navigate around. And I think it's maybe interesting if we think back to how this year began, and we had the capture of Maduro in Venezuela. And if we think about that, I mean, it was kind of shocking at the time, but in retrospect, that was actually quite a sort of clear and contained military operation. And if we look at now what's happening in the Middle East, it's not quite clear what the goal is, and the scope of this conflict is just so much bigger. Big ramifications, of course, for energy prices and therefore for the whole of the world economy. So this is really big. It's very destabilizing. What we've seen, of course, I'm sure all your listeners are familiar, but we've seen these US and Israeli strikes on Iran, followed by Iranian retaliation across the Gulf. So this is what analysts call a horizontal escalation. More countries being involved in that. And Iranian strikes not just on US bases, but also on energy infrastructure, and drones as far afield as Cyprus and Turkey and Azerbaijan. And so the risk that this escalates further and the scope, the arena this conflict is taking place in, could increase further. We could see the Gulf countries attacking back. There are lots of ways in which this could get worse. And even just as things stand, we've got the Strait of Hormuz, which is de facto blocked, and that is interrupting vast quantities of oil and gas supplies that should be being directed around the world. And that's seen oil and gas prices shoot up and a lot of financial market jitters as a consequence. And we're seeing in our forecasts, of course, we're revising up our inflation forecasts, we're revising down our growth forecasts. This is going to have a real hit around the world, of course. For the Gulf, it's huge. We've got those energy production facilities in some cases. In Qatar, for example, that big LNG facility completely offline. We've got Asia very exposed to higher energy prices, and Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the impact that we see that's right in front of us is clearly significant. But I think the more interesting discussion for all of us is sort of the various scenarios that could play out based on, how long could this go? right? I mean, initially, most people seem to think, well, similarly, you mentioned, Venezuela. Most people seem to think, well, it'll be tight, it'll be quick, that doesn't appear to be the case right now. So as you look at, sort of the scenarios playing out, what's your sense of, some of the real impact? I mean, obviously it'll impact GDP, I'm sure, in a number of different areas, right? Markets, and it's clearly impacting inflation, for sure. How are you looking at this right now? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, so it's hard to, exactly play it out. But what are your sort of thoughts on what we're seeing from a timing standpoint?
Yes. So I think when things are this unstable and unpredictable, what's most helpful for firms is scenario planning.
Yeah.
And we have three scenarios for how we see this playing out. And in large part, as you say, the key question is how long will this last? So our core scenario, with a lot of risk attached to it, is that this will be a conflict that remains at this kind of level of intensity for around the 4 to 8 week period. And that reflects the fact that this is incredibly expensive for the US. It is incredibly costly, not just the cost of the munitions that are involved, but also the impact that this has then on petrol prices in the US. And we know we've got US midterms approaching, and we know that the American public, there was less than a third of the public supporting the war in Iran before it began. That proportion is only going to decrease. So for Trump, there is a strong incentive to wrap this up fairly rapidly. The difficult question is how do we get overlap in that kind of Venn diagram of what the US is willing to accept, what Israel is willing to accept, and what Iran is willing to offer? And it remains very unclear what that will be. So there's also a scenario where this could be continuing right up through that kind of 2 months plus level of a period of time, and seeing oil prices and gas prices higher for longer. Final scenario, of course, the kind of the worst case escalation is we start to see other countries in the Gulf retaliating and joining this. We've seen Trump is asking if other countries in Europe, for example, or in Asia will come and help to open that strait. If we do see that kind of increase in the number of actors involved in the conflict, then that's the sort of worst case scenario. And if we see the Strait of Hormuz blocked for months and months, that's going to have a horrible impact on global energy prices, financial markets. I think we would definitely be in a concerning situation if this doesn't get wrapped up.
Yeah, yeah. So that's good. That's those scenarios make a lot of sense. It's hard when you're in the middle of something like this, and it's so dominant relative to any of the discussion regarding, the economic landscape, geoeconomic landscape, et cetera. But let's try to kind of shift a little bit and, look at, there had been going into the year some, encouraging news, right? There are some things that people felt good about. Um, what's your sense of that now? In other words, how are you feel? I know it's impossible to just put this aside and say, well, if that didn't happen, but given the entirety of what is going on, what are some of the things that you still feel like are relatively positive and could be some, things that we could expect that won't be significantly impacted or not impacted in a way that's really going to be detrimental to what's happening?
Yeah, so I think that the key thing to talk about here is investment. And at the start of the year, looking at Europe in particular, we had two kind of narratives around where we expected growth to come from. And one was we've got lower inflation, we've got lower interest rates, we should start to see a bump in consumer spending and domestic demand. And I think that narrative has died a bit of a death at this point. Unfortunately, we're going to have higher inflation. We're unlikely to get any further the rate cuts for the moment. Markets are more concerned about rate rises. So consumer spending still under pressure. But the second narrative, the second big growth driver is investment. And in Europe, there are a couple big things happening right now. One is Germany has done this big fiscal U-turn They're now issuing new debt and they are making vast new investments in infrastructure and in defence. They've put 1.1 trillion euros on the table for the next 12 years. Now, that's about a quarter of the size of the German economy, which is, of course, the biggest economy in Europe. So this is a lot of money. This is very significant. And that's going to play out over the next 12 years. Now, the other thing that's happening specifically this year is the EU put together this big recovery plan right after the pandemic. So this recovery and resilience facility runs out at the end of August this year. And the way it works is that any of the projects funded under this fund have to be complete by the end of August if they're going to be refunded. And so there's a big push in those construction projects. They have to be finished by the end of August. So we are going to still see that bump in spending. So places like Italy, where they've got a lot of those funds that they can potentially, and these are grants as well. There are some loans, but it's the grants that countries are really doubling down to use up, because if they don't use them by the end of August, that money disappears. So we do see this sort of tailwind from investment. And if we look in the US, of course, the AI capital expenditure boom, that is still ongoing as well. So investment, particularly in the AI sector and AI infrastructure, is still going to be supportive there.
Yeah. The investment in Europe, is it geared toward infrastructure? Is it geared toward our space, if you will, the IT space, or is it more general infrastructure spending?
So infrastructure spending in very broad terms, but one thing that Germany really lags on is digital infrastructure. So yes, they are spending on that. Yeah. And the other area they're really spending is in defence. And I think Europe has very much woken up to the need for what France has termed strategic autonomy. And for Germany in particular, we are seeing suddenly a lot more spending, a lot more thinking about what that German defensive posture will look like. But more broadly, we've also, of course, got new NATO spending targets. And these are, 5% of GDP overall by 2035, of which 3.5% on core defence and 1.5% on related infrastructure. And that includes a lot of quite tech-heavy areas, things like R&D for defence, things like cybersecurity, things like protection of critical infrastructure. And I think these are areas where we are going to see more investment that will be relevant to the IT sector.
Yeah, and for the most part, it seems like most of the countries are adhering to it. Although there was a interesting, I saw Trump on CNBC or someplace last week indicating that he was frustrated with Spain because Spain wasn't committing to it, but he didn't call out anybody else. So I'm assuming they're probably the rest of the European countries are adhering to the strategy.
Well, I mean, if we look at how effective they were at getting to 2% of GDP, I think I'd be similarly skeptical about them actually getting to 5% of GDP when they say they will. But at the same time, there is change. The external environment has changed. The level of threat and the level of reliability of the US as a security guarantor have very much changed. So I think subsequent to what we saw with Greenland earlier this year, now what's happening in the Middle East with what's going on with Ukraine, there is definitely a realization that something has to change. And we've also, of course, had this big new announcement by France that it will be, at least to some degree, extending its nuclear umbrella to European allies and involving them in that sort of decision-making as well, next to NATO as a kind of additive level. So there's going to be more investment in nuclear warheads effectively in Europe as well now.
So what about inflation and interest rates in Europe? Well, how's that going? How do people feel about that? How do you feel about that? How's that playing out?
Well, it was going quite well until everything started in the Middle East, and now we are going to have higher inflation. And it shouldn't be the scale of the shock that we had in 2022. I would say that. In 2022, when Europe was heavily reliant on Russian gas and that suddenly got cut off, that was a huge shock to the European economy. And now there's been a big effort to diversify energy supply. So we have a lot of LNG coming from the US, for example, and from Norway, as well as from Qatar, which of course has been cut off now. So the scale of the shock is, for the moment at least, less because of the fact that we've got this diversified picture now. We've also seen a lot of firms looking to reduce their energy intensity. So that might be by making processes more efficient, maybe electrifying, or it might be by putting that energy intensive production somewhere else. So BASF, for example, that's Germany's biggest chemicals firm. They've got this big new plant in China. It's a lot more cost effective to do that energy intensive production in China than it is in Europe. So that's kind of reduced their vulnerability to this kind of an energy price shock.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it is an energy price shock and it is going to keep inflation higher. Central banks will be looking very closely, not just at this supply side shock, but also at what it does to inflation expectations. Because ideally, they'll want to be able to look through this and say, well, this is just an external issue that will be temporary. But if people really start to think, no, actually, this is going to persist, and this means that inflation will be much higher for longer, that will have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy effect, raising inflation expectations, and that will potentially lead then to higher interest rates as well.
Yeah. Last year at this time, we can't get past that, but last year at this time, tariffs were the big discussion, right? I mean, we both remember it very well. And I think we've probably talked about this, maybe not during a podcast, because I don't know that we've done one since then with you, but we had our big event last year where you spoke on Liberation Day. And in the evening before, you probably spent most of it trying to figure out what in the world is going on here. But that day was memorable for all of us. And you did a fabulous job telling us at least what was going on at the time, and as best you could as to figure out what your sense of the ramifications of that would be. But I guess what I would say is, while the tariffs have still kind of, been in the mainstream, there's been a lot of discussion. I know the Supreme Court has made some declarations relative to whether they are legal or not, etc. Overall, it doesn't seem to have landed and have become and was as significant as everybody thought it was going to be a year ago. I'll make that statement, but what's your take on that? Because I'm certainly not the expert here.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And I do think that this AI investment boom in the US has, to a large degree, kind of made the impact of those tariffs kind of disappear to some extent. Like, it's hard to dissociate. Like, the fact that US growth has remained quite robust has nothing to do with the tariffs, but it does also kind of make it harder to see what's going on underneath the surface. And global trade has been fairly resilient. We had a lot of front loading as countries tried to get ahead of the tariffs, for example.
Yep.
I think that the key issue here is uncertainty. And for Europe, for other countries around the world, the question of uncertainty, it had kind of receded a little bit towards the end of last year as we seemed to reach a kind of slightly more stable outlook. And that has really changed now since that February ruling by the Supreme Court. As you say, that was outlawing the use of the IEEPA tariffs, which for the most part, those were the so-called reciprocal tariffs that were applied at different rates to countries all around the world. So those are out, and instead we've got this 10% blanket global tariff, but it's only in place for 150 days.
Right.
And Trump wants to rebuild his tariff wall, so he's launching investigations now under the national security umbrella, and also under the unfair trade practices area of legislation. So he's got other ways to do this. It will take longer for him to put them together because we have to have these investigations first, but they will be more permanent afterwards. And I think for firms, this is, once again, it's the same problem that, okay, we've got 10% tariffs plus the sectoral tariffs for the next 150 days, then the 10% tariffs will presumably disappear if nothing else is in place for a while. And then at some point, we're going to have these national security and unfair trade practices tariffs coming in at we don't know what rates and we don't know quite when. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some more of this kind of sudden export front loading as those 10% tariffs drop off. Suddenly there's more exports surging into the US, and then with the expectation that actually it's going to get harder after that.
Yeah.
So another year of slightly bumpy, I would say, trade flows that we can expect, and this continuing kind of uncertainty that is quite off-putting for firms looking to invest because they just quite simply don't know what the terms of trade will be.
Yeah, and there's no level of consistency, and that makes it really hard for people to, sort of run their businesses and manage it because everything is sort of a new strategy that has got to be deployed because something else has just come up. So yeah, we'll have to watch that carefully. I mean, obviously it will remain a major component of, I think, Mr. Trump's strategy or President Trump's strategy for sure. Let me shift for a minute, Emily. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is the changing leadership landscape around Europe, right? Because there's been a number of different, changes in leaders and philosophies and, talk to us about what's happening. Is it starting to stabilize itself a little bit? Or are we going to see some more churn in the next short period of time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The first thing that we're going to be watching is the Hungarian election. This is coming up in April, and
Yep.
Viktor Orban is facing the biggest challenge yet to his brand of illiberal conservatism. So the way that that election plays out will be quite consequential, particularly when it comes to EU decision making on controversial topics like sanctions on Russia, because Viktor
Mm.
Orban has often been the dissenting, vetoing voice in the room there. So Hungary is the first one to watch. Um, then we've got some interesting votes coming up. One to watch later this year is Sweden. We've got German state elections, and then next year we've got the French presidential election. And these are, I think, interesting to look at because of how immigration is going to be such a big topic in those elections. And I think they're really just indicative of the fact that across the political spectrum, a much, much tougher stance on immigration is becoming part of the mainstream. And so in Sweden, we've had the centre right in government with support from the far right. We're expecting the centre left to come in later this year, but they are going to hold on to those really tough migration laws that have been introduced now. That position on migration is not going to change, and that's a real shift for the centre left in Sweden. In Germany, we're going to see a lot of concern. I think you can definitely anticipate some headlines in the autumn about those state elections because the far right is set to do very, very well. And that will leave the centre right with a very difficult question about do they cooperate? Do they
Mm.
break the firewall that has always existed against cooperation at any level of government with the far right? Or do they say, actually, you know what, like this is the only way for us to have any say in what happens? And honestly, the far right is getting so much of the vote that it's anti democratic to not allow them to govern. This
Mm.
is viewed with a lot of concern in Germany because the alternative for Germany, it's a really extreme far right party. It's being watched by the security services. There's concern that it's been feeding information to Russia. This is not the kind of Georgia Maloney far right party. So
Mhm.
there's going to be a lot of concern about that. And then, of course, the big one is 2027 France presidential election. We think they'll bring the parliamentary election forward as well to align with it. It's Macron's second and final term right now. So definitely going to have a new president. And the way the polls look right now, it seems likely that that will be a far right president in France.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I mean, there's so much to think about when you kind of look at that, and the implications of that are really significant in Europe for sure. And obviously the rest of the world, but certainly within Europe. Um, so one of the items that I think is important as we start to wrap up here a little bit is what's happening in the IT space. And I know, when you speak to our group, very interested in all of the political things and all of the, the items that really matter. But one of the things that's going on is we've got a pretty significant memory shortage happening in the industry that doesn't appear to be, minor and doesn't appear to be short-lived, or going to be short-lived. Have you looked at that at all? And have you factored any of that into some of your growth projections as you've looked at the 2026 and beyond?
Yes, so various of my colleagues have been looking at this in
Yeah.
quite some detail. As you say, this is a big story.
Yeah.
We're calling it the memory chip mega cycle because it looks to be the biggest super cycle that we've seen in these kind of chips so far this century.
Yeah.
And for Asian economies, this is great news. This will be supportive of growth because they are producing these chips, and clearly demand is soaring. For buyers in the West, it's a more tricky situation. Clearly, the producers are going to want to sell to the more generous, deep-pocketed AI data center buyers. That might well leave a lot of other firms scrabbling to either get their hands on these memory chips or having to pay significantly higher prices. One thing my colleagues have pointed out is that this isn't the same as the 2021 chip shortage, where these were chips that were used in cars to a large extent, and it was very, very hard to substitute for them. And there was a really big hike in the prices that people were having to pay for cars. Cars are a very big chunk of the consumer price basket. So that pushed inflation way up and had a real macroeconomic impact. For these memory chips, they're a much smaller part of things like consumer electronics. Consumers spend less in terms of their like overall expenditure on consumer electronics. It's a smaller part of that price basket, so it's got less of a big macroeconomic impact. But of course, it is still significant. Likely to be particularly difficult for those kind of B2C firms selling PCs, selling fairly low-end smartphones, so it's really hard to pass those higher costs on to the customer. Might be a bit easier to handle more for the B2B sector. So servers, for example, which need an awful lot of memory chips, but it is easier to pass on those costs. And we do have more capacity coming on stream, and there is to some degree some kind of a substitution that might be possible as well. So not as bad as 2021, but still, yes, as you say, a very big story, and the kind of price and availability questions are going to remain valid for as well this cycle runs its course.
Yeah, it seems like it. Now, I think I think we're kind of right in the beginning of it now, where I think people were aware of it. Now it's kind of like become everybody's aware of it. So we're probably at peak sort of focus, and then typically what happens in these kinds of things is it'll dissipate a little bit over time, and people will figure out different things. But it does appear to be a very significant. It could potentially have a very significant impact to, overall prices, overall sales, results throughout 2026. Seems like,
Yeah, just waiting for that new capacity to come online now.
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly earlier that on April 14th and 15th in Amsterdam, we have our annual GTDC European Summit. And we're thrilled to have you back on the 15th speaking to all of our European, all the folks who come to the event, which pretty much consists of about 50 European suppliers or global suppliers and the European distributor community. And so we're really looking forward to that meeting. You've been there before, so you know the group, they know you, but what are some of your messages there? What are some of the things that you plan to cover during that event?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to see what's going on in the global economy by
What happens
mid,
that day, right? Or the day before.
Exactly. Who knows
Right.
where we'll be by that point.
But there'll be
No,
something for sure.
there will definitely be something. I think, I mean, the AI boom, it's really significant at the macro level. That's definitely something to think about. And if that bubble were to burst at some point, that is a key risk to be watching. I think the US tariffs, we shouldn't forget about them. They are still this highly unpredictable headwind that's still there in the background, and we're going to be more concerned about it later this year when the new tariffs start coming in. And then, of course, what's happening with the conflict in the Middle East, how that conflict is developing, what the end game might be, what the off-ramp might be, and what that's doing to energy prices. I think that's clearly going to have to be at the heart of what we're talking about, because that question around inflation and interest rates and what that does to growth around the world is going to be super important.
Yeah, and and I'm thinking about it now, and you just went through the three scenarios, and by then, scenario number one will have played out, right? That'll be another 4 weeks from now before we actually have the event, and it's been going on for 2, I guess, 2.5, maybe 3. So we'll be right at that scenario one time frame. So that'll be interesting in terms of, okay, where does it go from here now? So
Exactly.
depending on where we're at, and who knows, maybe, God willing, maybe, by then things will have gotten better. We can only hope for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good. Well, Emily, this has been fabulous as always. We really, I have to tell you how excited the folks who have attended the event before and are planning to attend again are to have you come back and speak to them. It's always a highlight of our agenda. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you and listening to your insights. And of course, GTDC, and I talked to Constance about this, has developed a wonderful relationship with the EIU, and you guys help us globally at all our events, and it's terrific. So we're really thankful for that.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. I'm really looking forward to being there. I'm sure it's going to be another great event.